everybody, Damon D here, and these are some really terrible albums, so let's get right to it. At number 10, Korn from 2007 with Untitled. Now this is the band's only studio release without an official drummer. David Silveria was kicked out or quit, depending who you talk to, in 2006, and this is prior to the arrival of Ray Luzier in 2007. So Jonathan Davis recruited Brooks Wackerman to play drums and Terry Bozzio of Missing Persons fame. So as session musicians, those dudes can play drums, and you're thinking, okay, at least the drums are going to be solid, which the drums aren't bad. But I think the production is the main problem here, which is it's very kind of mid-rangey and muddy. And then to me, the riffs don't really stand out, right? Because you know, even if you're not necessarily a Korn fan, there's definitely some iconic riffs that when you hear them, you're like, oh yeah, that's Korn. This record doesn't have that. And there's even some talk that this was a Jonathan Davis solo record more than anything else. And according to Davis, it was released without a title on purpose. Quote, why not just let our fans call it whatever they want to call it? How about not very good? At number 10, Korn with Untitled.
At number 9, Bad Religion with Into the Unknown from 1983. So Into the Unknown is the second studio album by punk rock legends from Southern California, Bad Religion. This was released in 1983 on Epitaph Records. The album was a departure from the previous album of hardcore punk. This was a wild kind of departure to this prog-related, excursion with piano and synth and slower songs and just atmospherics and a really strange brew that doesn't really work. And I'm not sure why they would do that, because you're trying to build this certain specific audience and then you just go completely into left field on your next release. And interesting to note that they had a show to support this record and only 12 people showed up because the punks were like, hey, I don't want to hear synth. And it didn't really go very well. And actually the band broke up after the album's release, which should tell you all you need to know. Now they did get back together in 1985, so things actually worked out because 40 something years later, they're still going and still playing. So, but this was definitely the wrong decision to make with going in this weird prog, longer songs related excursion, which doesn't make any sense from what they kind of the core of what they are, which is a bang it out, punk rock, high intensity. At number 9, Bad Religion with Into the Unknown. At number 8, The Stooges with The Weirdness. Now this was the first Stooges album of new material since Raw Power. Final album with guitar player, with founding guitarist Ron Ashton, who died in early 2009. This is from 2007. And the problem here, I think, is one of not only the quality, which the title track, The Weirdness, kind of has Iggy Pop doing this kind of this mid-tempo, slow rock thing with him kind of doing this deep, voice crooning that's almost, I don't want to say like a lounge act, but there's no power there, there's no intensity there, it's just kind of this middle of the road, kind of boring, which is one of the things you would never say about the Stooges is boring, which I think is probably one of the worst things that they could be. Interesting factoid here is that Mike Watt played bass on this. Steve Albini produced this, so you're thinking, okay, Mike Watt's in there, Steve Albini produced it, we got the comeback of the Stooges, this is going to be a powerhouse, blow your doors off record, and it just doesn't really happen, just doesn't really get there. There's some okay songs on here, but overall, it's really not a great effort. And I think part of the problem is if you're going to go from Raw Power to this, some of it is history too, right? Expectation. Look, Iggy Pop, everybody knows who that is. The Stooges, everybody knows. You're expecting something and you don't quite get it. And again, I think this kind of mid-tempo, slower, slower style, song structure is not that interesting. When you think of the Stooges, man, you want something that's in your face. It's going to be that kind of, punk rock energy, and this doesn't have it. So at number 8, the Stooges with The Weirdness. At number 6, Chris Cornell with Scream. So the challenge here was, this was always going to be a little bit different of a release for Chris Cornell, who's obviously, everyone knows from Soundgarden, Audioslave, and even earlier solo stuff is more guitar focused, whether he's playing acoustic guitar or not. But this is Timbaland producing, so you're going to get kind of a, to me, more like an adult contemporary kind of Justin Timberlake-y vibe, which actually track 7, Justin Timberlake is doing background vocals. So, the title cut here, Scream, is probably the most well-known song. Adult contemporary pop, a little bit of electronica happening here. It's, alternative-y, adult contemporary, I guess is the best way to describe it. The title cut, Scream, is probably the best well-known track, which not my favorite, but you could see where, I guess some people could be into this kind of direction. But there's some real stinkers on here. Part of Me is a really strange, that song is weird. I mean, it's definitely not like his style of singing, and it just doesn't really work with that kind of style of music, in my opinion, especially on that track, Part of Me. I would say if I was going to listen to this type of music, I probably would go Justin Timberlake, not Chris Cornell, for this style of music. Or, these, all the pop ladies do this kind of thing, the Katy Perrys and Gagas and all that stuff. Like, they do this, I think, a little better than he did. So again, this is not something I'm going to listen to again. At number 6, Chris Cornell with Scream. At number 5, Black Sabbath, Forbidden. So Forbidden is actually the 18th studio album by Black Sabbath. This was put out in 1995. The lineup of this one is Neil Murray, Cozy Powell, and Tony Martin on vocals, and Jeff Nichols on keyboards. So that means there's only Tony Iommi of the original Black Sabbath, no Ozzy, no Bill Ward, and no Geezer. Can hardly be called Black Sabbath, honestly, with all those replacements. But let's keep going. The opening track, Illusion of Power, features Body Count member Ice-T delivering a spoken word type of passage in the song, which is kind of strange. And let's get into some of the quotes from Tony Iommi, which I think these are very instructive on why this was such a disaster. According to Tony Iommi, quote, "We were pushed into a corner. Somebody at the record company suggested we work with Ice-T. My reaction was, who the hell is he? But we met up with him. He was a nice bloke and also a fan of Black Sabbath. Ernie C. of Body Count ended up producing. Ding, ding, ding. That's a problem too." So there's 2 red flags right there. Like, at this point, you should just go, we're done. This is not going to happen. But they forged on ahead. To quote Tony Iommi again, quote, "Ernie C. ended up producing Forbidden, which was a terrible mistake. Ernie tried to get Cozy Powell to play these hip-hop style drum parts, which quite rightly offended him. You don't tell Cozy Powell how to play drums." I would agree with that. So just the fact that most of Black Sabbath isn't here, what does Ice-T have to do with Black Sabbath? Ernie C., who is actually a pretty decent guitar player, but I'm not sure why he would agree to all of those changes and go in a direction that clearly was not a Black Sabbath direction. And the proof here is that this was 1995, and the next Black Sabbath record wasn't until 2013, the album 13, Ozzy comes back in, Geezer comes back in, and you probably get more on the right track of what Black Sabbath actually should be versus this garbage. So I would say skip this one. At number 5, Black Sabbath with Forbidden. At number 4, Megadeth, Risk. So I think one of the challenges with this one is, you're Megadeth, known for a certain type of music, especially with Marty Friedman, the solos, Marty Friedman and Dave Mustaine, those guitar solos, Hangar 18, if you listen to that kind of stuff and then you're going to listen to this one, that's why I think why people don't like this record, because people know how good those guys actually are and can be, and then this doesn't really cut it. So this record slows the tempo down quite a bit, and according to Dave Mustaine, quote, "Risk was me capitulating to Marty Friedman's desire to be more of an alternative band, and we kept slowing down and slowing down and slowing down." He goes on to say, "People wanted a Megadeth record. They didn't want to see me bending over backward to keep Marty Friedman happy because Marty wanted us to sound like Dishwalla." That's pretty funny. I don't know if that's true. I mean, he probably just brought that name out of nowhere because Megadeth shouldn't sound like Dishwalla. Mustaine goes on to say he doesn't regret making Risk because he tried to keep everyone happy, drummer Nick Menza and Marty Friedman, but ultimately those guys left the band and it kind of all went to you know where. So what he should have done was stuck by his guns and said, "I don't really want to go in this direction. Let's do a traditional Megadeth record." But he didn't do that. And I think some of that is due to his ability to, or in his nature, he likes to blame other people for stuff. Like he still blames Metallica for things and Marty Friedman for things. And it's like, well, ultimately, Dave Mustaine is Megadeth, really. So he should be the one in charge of saying the direction of the band and who should be in it and what they should be doing. But yeah, this isn't really a good record. You know, I listened to it recently and there's this kind of country influenced song. And if you're coming into this thinking this is traditional Megadeth music, it's not. Some people do like it. Maybe they were going for more of an alternative rock thing that was happening at the time. But again, I think this is another one where the artists didn't follow their instinct and their gut, and then what they put out ultimately didn't work, and they moved on and actually made better records after this one was over. So at number 4, Megadeth, Risk. At number 3, Van Halen with Van Halen 3. Now at this point in Van Halen's band life or existence, I think they were definitely running on fumes here. You know, you bring in Gary Cherone, so it's the third vocalist after, 10, 11 years with Sammy Hagar. I just don't know that there was much kind of, creativity left. This record is about 65 minutes, which is way too long, for one. Number 2, much as we love Eddie Van Halen as one of the best guitar players in the history of the universe, he's not a lead vocalist, and there's a track here where he tries to sing, and it's really not good. It's really terrible. It's just not good. That was really a serious mistake. And the other thing here is that Michael Anthony plays on 3 tracks. He played bass on 3 tracks. So Eddie Van Halen played bass on those. And then it turns out Alex Van Halen wasn't there for these sessions. So it appears that Eddie might have played drums on this too. So maybe this was more of an Eddie Van Halen solo outfit with Gary Cherone versus a full band situation. The songs aren't really that interesting here because I'm trying to think of a song here that really, if you were a Van Halen fan, which one would it be? Can you name one? If you can, put it in the comments. But yeah, this is probably the point where Eddie Van Halen is thinking, yeah, Wolfgang Michael Anthony's on his way out. We're gonna bring Wolfgang in. We're just gonna be, this other thing. And soon after this, Gary Cherone left or got kicked out or however you want to phrase it. And Van Halen was really never quite the same after this. Their output just, until 2012, they didn't really do much of anything. So I think this was just the time when the band probably should have just said, we're not going to do a record here because this was really not a good effort. And, Gary Cherone, everybody knows what he did with Extreme. He can sing. At number 3, Van Halen with Van Halen 3. At number 2, you knew this was coming. You did. All of you knew. If you watch a video like this, you know this is coming and this album deserves to be on there. Metallica, Saint Anger at number 2. And the main reason is, if there was one reason, as somebody who listens to music, that snare sound is dreadful. That pinging, I don't even know, the snare, the top head of the snare. I'm not a drummer, but look, I can recognize good drum sounds. Check out Matt Cameron's drumming on Super Unknown. That's a really great drum sound. So the drumming here itself is okay. It's fine, whatever. Lars, fine. He's fine, whatever. But the sound of the snare is terrible. It's too tight, and it's got this kind of pinging sound that really cuts through everything and sounds terrible. And then There's no guitar solos, which is an interesting choice because Kirk Hammett can play guitar solos, as we know, and James Hetfield can too. So there's none of those. And to that point, Kirk Hammett, quote, "We wanted to preserve the sound of all four of us jamming in a room. And we tried to put guitar solos on, but we just kept running into this problem. It really didn't sound right. It really sounded like an afterthought." That's interesting. So that would indicate that they were going to do overdubs of the guitar solos, because if it was the four of them in a room playing, he could actually play a guitar solo, but they probably overdubbed those, which is why he's saying that. And this is the first Metallica record that was a trio, because Newsted was out and Robert Trujillo wasn't in yet, so producer Bob Rock played bass. So maybe there was an influence on him playing bass, contributing to things, and kind of the songs turned out the way that they did. You know, it seems like they went in a more alternative, grunge, kind of angsty direction, which, whatever, that's fine. But this is not a good Metallica record. It's not. And it's pretty unusual for them to play zero guitar solos, because when you think of Metallica, you're thinking of probably some double bass drumming, you're probably thinking of guitar solos, you know, and if you put albums out like Justice for All, the Black Album, you know, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, this one, Master of Puppets, you know, those are some classic metal records, and this one is not that. At number 2, Metallica with Saint Anger. All right, ladies and gentlemen, at number 1, this is going to be Metallica with Lou Reed, with Lulu. And, you know, I think the issue here is the musical style, right? Is this kind of Lou Reed and his, you know, avant-garde, you know, art rock style with Metallica's obviously heavy metal sound. And it just doesn't really blend well together, in my opinion. You know, I think if I was going to say, in 3, 2, I think if I was going to listen to Lou Reed, I would go listen to Lou Reed. If I was going to listen to Metallica, I'll go do that. I don't think them together really works very well. Other people do disagree. There's people that actually like this record. I'm not one of them. And, you know, the lyrics are based on a play of German expressionist writer Frank Wedekind, which explores dark and complex themes. Yeah, I mean, in theory, that would be interesting, right? Dark and complex themes in Metallica, those probably would work well. I just think that the Lou Reed, like, I'm not really a fan of his style in general. Kind of that, kind of, you know, it's almost like spoken word talking versus singing. You know, he doesn't have much range as a singer or vocalist, so not that interesting to me. I wouldn't really seek a project like this out.